Welcome and thank you everyone for attending this virtual discussion hosted by the Oxnard City Council. And as it is a special meeting of the City Council, they are actually online and in attendance. I'm going to make an effort here to get a roll call. So if I could have the City Council members unmute, and then I'm going to go through the list and see if we can get a quick attendance so that we can formally begin the meeting. Mayor Flynn? Oh, okay, we actually have to unmute each of you, so that'll happen in just a second here. Okay. Go ahead and unmute everyone else. And by the way, we are live not only on Zoom, but the city's television channels and YouTube as well. And if there's a problem with the broadcast, I apologize ahead of time. We've been having difficulties with the technology and our connection with Spectrum. So we're going to do our best to carry this through for the whole session. Okay. Okay. Paul?
Yeah, it looks like we have not everyone.
Okay, let's go ahead and start.
We've got Carmen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
McDonald.
Okay. So I think for this town hall, what we can do is when we have everyone logged on, we'll make note of it so that we don't have to do a. I hope it's okay that we don't do an oral roll call right now, because if you're logged in here, we can see it. So that way we can begin. Okay. So this is a discussion again that the City Council wanted us to host. And it is, I wanted to acknowledge that it is one of many conversations that have been occurring around not only our community, but obviously across the country. The police chief and I were invited to one such discussion several weeks ago, and I want to acknowledge that that discussion was called The Talk. We're going to get that slide up on the screen because I want to thank them for inviting us to participate. And that was a few weeks ago. There's the slide there. We participated in this, and the actual video from this panel discussion is available online, I believe, on Facebook. So I want to thank the people who put that together for inviting me and the police chief, and that was Jordan Ward, Dexter Nunnery, Ross Fontes, and Tamar Lee. So thank you very much for inviting us to that discussion. Again, that video is available online. For this discussion tonight, we're fortunate to have a collection of community members to join us. So I'm going to introduce them very quickly in alphabetical order. So we have Maite Alonso, who is a Oxnard resident, grew up actively participating in the Oxnard Police Activities League, otherwise known as PAL, which offers community youth a variety of recreation and enrichment opportunities. She recently graduated from Georgetown University. Congratulations. That's a major, major institution in the nation's capital. And her major was in government with a concentration in education, inquiry, and justice. So thank you for returning to Oxnard and participating. Next, we have Cynthia Gonzalez, who is an attorney, and her family have resided in Ventura County for more than 30 years. Cynthia became involved in advocating for community and public safety after losing her 24-year-old son to gang violence. She has become a strong advocate for community surveillance cameras and continues to fight for the families of victims. Next, we have Terrell Harrison, a lifelong Oxnard resident. Mr. Harrison is the director of the city's Cultural and Community Services Department, which provides library, recreation, and after-school program services. With more than 30 years of service working for the city, he continues to find innovative ways to provide programs that positively impact our community, particularly its youth groups. Next, we have Regina Hatcher Crawford, who is an Oxnard resident and president of the Ventura County chapter of the NAACP. She is a third-generation civil rights activist and works with local law enforcement agencies to address complaints of racially motivated police efforts, such as traffic stops. Next, we have Mr. Damon Jenkins, who is a senior public defender working for the County of Ventura and is a resident of Oxnard for 6 years now. He has 10 years of criminal defense experience working on all types of cases ranging from resisting arrest to murder. Next, we have Randi Latimer, is a lifelong resident of Oxnard. He's also a retired Oxnard police commander who spent more than 30 years working for the city in a career that spanned from bicycle patrol to internal affairs. He counseled young children as a youth officer in the Police Activities League, and Randi remains actively involved in the community. And we have Mr. Peter Martinez, who's also a lifetime Oxnard resident. Mr. Martinez was born and raised in the Colonia neighborhood. He grew up attending local schools and has been very active in the community since attending high school over 40 years ago. He's a retired Ventura County probation officer and has been teaching criminal justice at Ventura College for the past 22 years. And finally, we have our police chief, Scott Whitney, who needs no introduction. But more importantly than anything, he is the chief of police for the city of Oxnard. And I'm sorry, myself, my name is Alex Nguyen. I'm the city manager for the city of Oxnard. So what we're going to do, and the basic format, just so that the audience and participants can get a sense of where we're headed tonight, we're each going to make opening comments, and then the police chief will review some policy changes that he is proposing for the department. We're going to go through those one at a time and have the panelists chime in with their take on what he's proposing. And after that segment, we're going to go to participation questions from the audience, and we already have a handful of those questions that were sent in ahead of time, and then we'll take some live as well. I'll do my best to balance between live and pre-received questions. Of all the questions that we get through the Zoom system, the ones we can't get to tonight, we will answer them in writing and post them on the city's website. So as I mentioned at the opening, the police chief and I did participate in one such discussion a few weeks ago, and I made some opening comments there, which I'm not going to repeat tonight. So instead of me saying anything more, what I'd like to do is begin the night by showing a very brief video. Just as there's so many ways to introduce this topic tonight. And so I've just decided to choose one quick video. So if we can play that, and then we'll get to the panelists' opening comments. So I ask the audience to see this video as well as the panelists. Thank you.
My fellow Americans, we have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy.
During the summer of 1967, after years of growing racial tension, black neighborhoods in more than 150 cities erupted in protest, leading in some places to violent clashes with police and widespread destruction.
90 deaths, 2,000 injuries, 12,000 arrests.
In many cities, the unrest was sparked when black communities protested against abuse by mostly white police departments. Often, police and the National Guard responded with more force.
Mass arrests that swept up many innocent bystanders along with the lawbreakers. In the conflict between white authority and black ghetto, old grievances deepened and spread.
You cannot fight violent criminals with nonviolent methods. We had a war, and I think that you have to attack the war with warlike weapons and under warlike conditions.
What is responsible for this violence, for this rebellion, is the inability of the city government to feel, as human beings, the plights of the majority of the...
think
My fellow Americans.
I'll get it started just a second.
our apologies. We're going to start that over. It's not coming through on all the stations. Please be patient.
We have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy.
During the summer of 1967, after years of growing racial tension, black neighborhoods in more than 150 cities erupted in protest, leading in some places to violent clashes with police and widespread destruction.
90 deaths, 2,000 injuries, 12,000 arrests.
In many cities, the unrest was sparked when black communities protested against abuse by mostly white police departments. Often, police and the National Guard responded with more force.
Mass arrests that swept up many innocent bystanders along with the lawbreakers. In the conflict between white authority and black ghetto, old grievances deepened and spread.
You cannot fight violent criminals with nonviolent methods. We had a war, and I think that you have to attack the war with warlike weapons and under warlike conditions.
What is responsible for this violence, for this rebellion, is the inability of the city government to feel, as human beings, the plights of the majority of the people in this city. And that is the cause of this violence.
As a result, President Lyndon Johnson formed a national commission led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to study why the uprisings happened and how they might be prevented in the future. The Kerner Commission's conclusions were stark. It pointed to decades of pent-up frustration in black communities over police brutality, poverty, and the inequality caused by discrimination and segregation. And the commission placed the blame for those inequalities squarely on white Americans and racism.
Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American.
The Kerner Report called for sweeping changes to American society, more economic opportunity in black communities, better housing conditions, and more accountability for the police, including steps to stop police abuse, limit stop and frisk, and build trust between police and communities.
The Negro ghetto is a mystery to most police, except as a source of crime. But the commission suggested that police start looking at it as a place where people live.
It warned that failing to act would lead to more division and more unrest. The findings captured the public's attention, but Johnson, despite his work on civil rights, ignored them.
A year after the Kerner Commission report on rioting in America, a private study warned today that the nation has drifted closer to a racially divided society.
20 years ago today, the United States was shocked by a report on racism in America. There have been changes in 20 years. Some things are worse.
Firestorm of uncontrolled riots and violence that is still going on tonight.
The same conditions that led to the riots of the 1960s also led to the violence and disorder in South Central Los Angeles.
Civil disorders and solutions to the causes of the violence were addressed nearly 25 years ago. The findings in the 400-page report could have been written yesterday.
Michael Brown's body is still in the middle of the street after that 18-year-old was shot by a police officer.
Well, in the wake of the violence in Ferguson, Missouri, President Obama is proposing sweeping changes to police departments nationwide.
We can't have Ferguson and Baltimore happening again and again.
An update to the Kerner Commission report says by many standards, the rifts in American society have grown worse. Child poverty is up. School segregation has returned to 1968 levels.
What do you want?
I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my dick. I can't breathe shit.
George
So obviously that video clip, brief as it is, provides a little bit of historical perspective. The only thing I'll say about it is it only goes back to 1967. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. And again, we'll go in alphabetical order, so we'll start with Maite Alonso. Press the button.
Hello. So I want to reintroduce myself. My name is Maite Alonso. I was president of the Youth Directors Council for the Oxnard Police Activities League for about 5 years. But I feel like I'm here as a member of the community to bring a young, social justice-oriented point of view to really push Oxnard to think in a more progressive way about policing and racism in the community. Growing up, I don't really remember having negative interactions with the police personally, but I always feared the police. I was part of the Oxnard Police Activities League, where I served Thanksgiving dinners and was scared of, and still scared of them. This isn't a bad reflection of the Police Activities League and the job that they're doing, but that just shows that despite these efforts to get the police to be more involved in the community in a positive way and show up at car shows as friendly cops is just not enough. Because what I remember from interactions with the police is being at a peaceful protest 3 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and having police officers swing their batons, look me in the eyes, point at me, and laugh. And in that moment, I thought, who am I going to call when this police officer is beating me? I was following the rules. I was not talking back. I was going as an ally to show support for the Black people in America. And I was shot with rubber bullets, thrown tear gas, and pushed and shoved by police officers. And that is what I'm going to remember as my interactions with police officers. And those were just 2 days that I was personally terrorized by the police. But that's how Black people in America feel every time they're around the police, and that's how minorities feel when they see the police. Because at the end of the day, I feel like cops still have power over me. They still have a gun they can shoot me with, and I see that I am lesser to them when they have that position of power. Whether they mean to scare me or not, they still do. People make an argument that they're good cops and that all cops are not racist, and that might be true at a micro level, but at the macro level, we can't forget the origins of police that stem from times of slavery, where police officers were in charge of getting Black slaves back to their slave owners. That means police are supposed to get what they are instructed to perceive as bad people and bring them back to their systems of oppression. Now, in 2020, we don't have slavery, quote unquote, but we still have forms of oppression that are replicating those same forms of slavery, but we just have different names for them now. So we're blinded of how we are still being oppressed by white people in this country. When we think about policing, people think about community safety. Police are supposed to keep our community safe, but what are those major arrests that are happening in the city of Oxnard? Are they high-rate crimes and felonies, or are they misdemeanors that don't need incarceration and are instead different forms of keeping marginalized communities without power? The prison system, that's the new form of slavery. Mass incarceration of Latinos and Black people is simply another way that we are oppressing our Black, Indigenous people of color and taking away their power and their voices. Once we accept that we can't start to have conversations about ending racism without taking away the systems that disenfranchise minorities. We need to be empowering our communities through positive outlets to express themselves, to be active, and to stay out of trouble. So when we say defund the police, we're saying stop oppressing marginalized communities and start investing in them, start creating programs that serve the community and give them the power to thrive.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Cynthia Gonzalez, please.
Hi. I think I'm going to take my mask off.
Yeah.
because it's a little thick. My name is Cynthia Gonzalez, and as Mr. Nguyen said, I am an attorney here in Ventura County. I also grew up here and my husband and I have raised our family here. And in 2014, our son was murdered. Tonight, I don't sit here necessarily as an attorney or even as a commissioner for the Community Relations Commission. I sit here as a community member and as a mother that has ties also to black brothers and black cousins and nephews and uncles and a black father. And our world is so messed up right now. I heard someone say that there's no systemic racism in Ventura County, and that's an interesting statement. And I guess it would depend on how you define systemic racism. And actually, the NAACP president, Derek Johnson, he defined it as systems and structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage African Americans. There are a lot of systems here in our United States that do exactly that. The sadness that I feel right now is because when you think about the police, you don't want to think about the word brutality or excessive force or even criminal or murderer in the same sentence when you're thinking of the police, because we want to believe that if there's a problem, we call the police and that the police will come and they'll help resolve whatever that is and they'll enforce the law. Not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily happen in the black community. Now, my son was not murdered by the police. My son was murdered by a gang member. And does that mean that all gang members are murderers? No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, though, with our black community, unfortunately what happens is we're often seen as criminals, no matter what level we're on. I was on my way home from law school one night and got pulled over in Thousand Oaks. And one of the first questions I was asked is, are you on parole? Do you have a felony? Are you on probation? And I had never been on any of those things in my life. And at that moment, I thought, well, why is he asking me those questions before he even checks my driver's license? And that's what unfortunately, what a lot of people are feeling in this community is they are judged first. My cousins, my brothers, my uncles, my nephews, they're often seen as black males, or suspicious black males. And the unfortunate part about that is when you define them as suspicious black males, when you arrive on the scene, there's this thought that they're up to no good and that they need to be corralled or you need to protect yourself. And so sometimes I feel like the police create situations where they are afraid for their lives, and that's unfortunate. And I think that stems from racism, but I also think that it stems from lack of training. There's not enough training. There needs to be more training. When I was told a couple of weeks ago that they're only required to do 24 hours of training every 2 years, I believe it is. And that, to me, is crazy because of the things that they deal with. I mean, they have a license to kill people. They carry weapons. And so that's not good enough. It needs to be better. I don't even know what my time looks like, but you got me all right. And I think that we need to continue to have these conversations, and we need to continue to talk about what we need to do, but I also think we need to start looking at solutions. And some of the solutions should be alternatives. I'm not saying dismantle the police department, but I am saying maybe come up with a police oversight committee, or even come up with alternative community programs where they're not sent out to these low-level crimes, or their time isn't being spent on situations that don't require a lethal response. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to Terrell Harrison, please.
Good evening. Like Alex said before, my name is Terrell Harrison. I was raised in Oxnard, and I still live in Oxnard. I came here when I was 1 year old. I grew up with my mother as well as my father in the household. and I've worked for the city for over 30 years. I'm currently the Director of Cultural and Community Services, and I'm responsible for adult, youth, recreational programs, our library system, and our cultural arts programs in the city of Oxnard. I am a husband, I am a father, and I am a son, and I am a brother. And to many in this community, I'm considered a friend. But I'm also a representative of 2.7% of Oxnard's population because I'm a black man. Interesting thing about being a black man in this community is you hear things like, there is no systemic racism because we've had a black president. Race is not an issue anymore because, you know, I have black friends. Or my favorite is, I don't see color. And my response to that is always, I want you to see my color and realize I'm a black man and accept me for that. I may have a different culture than you. Accept my culture, accept who I am. I'm the president of California Police Activities Athletic League. I am on the National Board of Directors of Police Activities Athletic League. And the POW program is designed to bring youth and police together. And I'm happy to say that I've designed programs that affected people in the city, in the state, and around the country in bringing the two groups together. But in my 51 years on this earth, yes, I've been harassed by police. I've been pulled out of a car and frisked and asked, what am I doing here? Or what is my responsibility? Just when I was visiting one of my friends in Riverside. Had my father not been in law enforcement and they called the probation office, I don't know if they would have let me go. What I want everybody to realize is in dealing with young people, we don't recruit our police officers from Mars. We get them around from the city of Oxnard, from around the state and around the country. At one time, every single one of these police officers were young people. And what are we teaching our young people at our dinner table? Systemic racism starts in the home. So we need to change some ways how we police, but we also need to change what we teach in our homes to our young people. And I hope today that this conversation leads to actions that we can take in this city that make us better. Thank you.
Thank you. Regina Hatcher Crawford, please.
Good evening, everyone, and I have to correct you. I am the NAACP president, and I just don't do traffic stops. I'm all over Ventura County. We look at discrimination across the board, meaning in housing, in economics, in the workplace. We also look at criminal justice. So the NAACP is 111 years old, so we have a history of dealing with racism.
Into your mic.
We have a history of dealing with racism. So Ventura County is a unique city in the sense that we all believe that racism doesn't exist. We absolutely know, working on the ground, if you're part of the grassroots organizations, several of them, we know that systemic racism exists, institutional racism exists. Ventura County, what happened to George Floyd brought back memories of the Rodney King case, which my father at that time was in Simi Valley fighting. That was 30 years ago. We still haven't forgotten that. That's how deep-rooted racism is in this county. I just previously, prior to speaking, we just seen a newspaper clipping of the Klans here in Ventura County. So every day we get calls where racism is here. And so when a black president was elected, we seen that our work increased. When George Floyd was killed, we watched our work increase. And so what I have to say is this is deep-rooted over 400 years of oppression. And Cynthia did say something correctly, and so did you. It stems from being enslaved and systematically based on laws and legislations that we review all the time that need to be changed. We still have on the books right now that a president has to sign every 8 years for black people to vote in the United States. This is 2020. And so we have on the laws where police officers are afforded to be able to stop people just based on their subjective judgments. And so I've seen 3 laws that bother me. And so when we talked about that, that police stop happened to be my daughter, who graduated from UCR, University of Riverside, who was on her way to teach at Whitney. She had 4 police officers pull her over, stop, block her car. And she stood outside and she says, wait a minute, you all have guns. I'm standing here by myself. And just as you were asked that question, the officer was more interested in the type of car she drove. He was more interested in, oh, you're educated. That's systemic racism when we have to continue to hear that. So as a black community, as much as we trust and we have faith, we know that it's cultural. It's being taught in homes. We also understand that we're waiting for the shoe to fall off. So through our relationships with Oxnard PD, my daughter was able to run in, and the first person she ran into was police chief. And she sobbed. She cried. So for every black mother there, every mother, not even black mother, for every mother that heard George Floyd say, mama, that was a call. Because we're mothers that worry every night that our sons and even our daughters walk at our house. We're in prayer on our knees that they come back. This is just not something that just happened. This has been going on in the black community. And I got a call from a mother, 3 o'clock in the morning, crying because she's scared. So we got to do better as a community. And I'm speaking for all of Ventura County. We got to do better and stop walking around believing that racism does not exist in Ventura County. It absolutely does. And thank you.
Thank you. Damon Jenkins?
Growing up biracial, I quickly learned that race does matter. The way people perceive you matters. The way people perceive you oftentimes dictates how they treat you. I'm treated differently when I'm wearing my suit and I'm in court and it's winter and my skin's not too dark. Much different than when I'm out on the street wearing a hoodie. And that's been true my entire life. One thing that has changed recently is the use of cell phones, and that has brought the black experience, made it shown to the rest of the world, and it shows what we've already known, and that is we are treated differently based on the color of our skin. Some of my personal experiences are, before age 10, I remember being called the N-word. Fast forward 10 years later, I remember being at a basketball game and multiple people yelling that at me. And at that point in that 10 years, what had happened to me is I'd heard that so many times, I didn't even tell anyone about it because it had become normalized to me. Around that same time, I was detained and mistreated by police officers because I fit the description. Fast forward another 10 years later, and I had finished law school, and I had the exact same experience as Ms. Gonzalez. I get pulled over, and the very first thing that I'm asked is, are you on parole or probation? And it wasn't like, are you on them? It's, which one are you on? And I've never met Ms. Gonzalez before, and I don't think we might not have much in common other than being a certain color in public, but that experience is normal to us. The last experience I'll share about that is after passing the bar and becoming a lawyer, I worked with a black criminal defense attorney, and regularly I was mistaken for being the defendant. Meaning they would tell me, no, you can't go in there. the defendants aren't allowed. No, you can't sit there. Defendants aren't allowed. And that was based on the color of my skin. They couldn't comprehend that there would be 2 black lawyers. When I talk about that experience with my other coworkers that are not black, that's never happened to them. Part of the reason I got into the law is I thought it would be more of an equal playing field. I quickly learned that is not true. For example, in the public defender's office, our office represents more than 80% of the people charged with a crime in this county, yet we receive way less than half of the funding than the DA's office does. Likewise, the majority of my clients are minorities. They are disproportionately arrested and incarcerated. Who are my clients? My clients are me born under different circumstances. They are brothers, they are sisters, they are mothers, they are fathers. They are people that love, and they are people that are loved. They oftentimes do have mental health issues and drug abuse issues, but very, very few of the people I represent would anyone ever classify as being a bad person or a true threat to our society. So my job is oftentimes building a bridge between my client and a judge or a juror who looks nothing like them. I can't tell you how many cases I've tried in juries with black defendants next to me in front of 12 people, 12 jurors that were not black. And it's hard to get justice when there is a lack of education, there's a lack of awareness, a lack of empathy, and that all results in the mistreatment of minorities. And I see that every day. And I try to build a bridge so that people can see that this person next to me has a heart like them and should be treated the way they would want to be treated in that position. Outside of work, I'm also a board member of the Black Lawyers of Ventura County. We are a diverse group of lawyers that strive to positively impact our community. We've met multiple times and discussed and vented about the current events, and we're left with the question of what do we do? How do we make change? And we're currently in the process of drafting a demand letter, a letter of requests that we will present to our local law enforcement as well as our elected officials. And what we're striving for is to make a real change. The changes we are proposing, I anticipate and hope and will applaud the Oxnard Police Department and any other law enforcement that impose these de-escalation techniques, increasing de-escalation techniques, increasing education, and increasing oversight and reporting, especially when black unarmed people are killed. I think that these improvements will help the law enforcement. It will help improve the relationship between law enforcement and the community and improve public safety and officer safety for everyone. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Randi Latimer, please.
Thank you, Alex. First of all, it's an honor to be here, and I'm really honored to be able to speak on this panel. I believe I come from very unique perspective. Number one, being a lifelong resident of the city of Oxnard, being a black man, being the son of the first black police officer in the city of Oxnard, who was greeted on his first day on the job of when he walks into the squad room with the uniform, thinking that he's one of the brothers, and being greeted with who's going to ride with the N word, or who's going to ride with the coon. And every step of his career, he was, being my dad, James Latimer, was greeted with resistance. From being educated, I remember a story he told me about being educated and walking down the hallway with school books, and one of the white officers saying, "That's trouble right there." and educated in. That's trouble. Fast forward to every promotion he got, he was sued because of the color of his skin. I followed in his footsteps, and I became a police officer and retired as a commander, and therefore I was a policymaker. I was in charge of hiring. So those are the perspectives that I come with. And I still live in this community. I worked in this community my entire 30 years of law enforcement, which I had to be very judicious on my interactions with our community. But I was connected with our community. I was the co-director of our PAL program, and I'm now the president of our PAL program and other youth programs in our city. So, being a police officer in our city and being a policymaker put me in a unique position where people would ask me, I would watch things on TV and people would ask me, does that really happen? And well, it doesn't happen in Oxnard. This is my argument. I had an epiphany moment at a family reunion several years ago, and I thank my cousins who live on the East Coast who had to educate me. I would defend almost every action of police officers because I worked for a very progressive department where we were ahead of the game. We put in policy and digital recordings, internal audits. So we were, and we still are, Oxnard PD is still way ahead of the game. So we were in a heated discussion, and I defended a lot of the actions that they were talking about. I'm like, no way, that doesn't happen. We don't do that here. That doesn't happen in our department. Until my cousin said, you know what, Randy? It's great that you and your dad were able to make positive change in your department and that you have a progressive department that is willing to make changes and to do good things in your community. However, police brutality and bad interactions, negative interactions with police officers, everyday life in our community. So you need to understand that. And that really woke me up. And then having other conversations with officers, I probably can't go through that whole conversation, but just the fact that implicit bias and in some cases, stone cold racism does exist in the uniform, and training and proper hiring practices, we're finding officers who come from our community, or they don't necessarily have to come from the city of Oxnard, but come from a city or a diverse community that looks like the city that they're going to serve would be very beneficial, and very robust training and a recognition of the fact that there is institutional racism still in very high effect today. So, thank you.
Thank you. Peter Martinez, please.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening. My name is Peter Martinez, and I'm a lifelong resident of the city. Okay. Thank you, Alex. Good evening. I'm Peter Martinez. I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Oxnard. I was born and raised in the Colonia, to be specific, the Colonia Medical Center on Cooper Road. So from very young age, I spent a lot of time on Cooper Road. Then later on, we cruised Cooper Road. But watching the video reminded me the 1960s Oxnard PD. And I have article after article from the 60s of Oxnard PD. This one, the title is All's Quiet on the Colonia Front. So the Oxnard PD was an invading army. They were controlling the Colonia. This is the 60s. And it's one article after another about community folks asking for a probe of the Oxnard Police Department. Then I have articles from the 1970s, protest after protest against the Oxnard Police Department. Then there's a major disturbance on July 12, 1971 against the Oxnard Police Department. And I know it well because I was there, folks. And when you read the newspaper account, it's nowhere near accurate of what was taking place. People were finally fed up and pissed off at the racism and how they were being treated, and this was a result. And I remember vividly the 1970s, September 1970, there was an organized protest against the Vietnam War. By that time, there were 58,000 troops had been killed in Vietnam, and the vast majority were people of color. African American and Chicano soldiers. So there was an organized protest from Colonia Park to the community center. And we were marching up 3rd Street. This is a peaceful protest. And I look up on top of this roof, on top of the other roof, are Oxnard PD officers with their high-powered rifles. Now keep in mind, this is a peaceful protest. So folks, I have a very, very vivid recollection of the racism in Oxnard with the Oxnard Police Department. But I can say this, that the Oxnard Police Department today is not the police department of the 60s and 70s. And much to his credit, Chief Whitney, I give a lot of responsibility for bringing the police department to where it's at today. Very highly respected and I think very progressive. But I think it's very important that as we talk about police reform, we're going to fall short if we just simply talk about police reform. We need to talk about criminal justice reform, okay? And give you an example, I have this article, November 20th, 2009. It was a protest at the Ventura County Government Center by the NAACP and LULAC, the two oldest and largest civil rights organizations in the country. And they were there protesting how one of my coworkers, a black woman, was being treated by a white coworker. She filed a lawsuit. And I remember it well because she would come to me crying every morning, Peter, what do I do? What do I do? And she would tell me what happened that day. The problem was that ultimately he was fired, but it was an internal investigation and the matter should have been investigated by an outside agency, not internally, because the overall cultural problem of racism in the institution, the organization, was never addressed. In fact, that's the Ventura County Probation Department. Just this year, a division manager sent out an email to staff at the juvenile facility telling them very directly, do not speak Spanish in the workplace. Keep in mind, 2020, directed not to speak Spanish in the workplace. So, Ventura County Probation Agency, this is important because the other thing that happens, the research points out that persons on probation or parole are likely to be incarcerated for technical violations, right? That impacts the criminal justice system. What happens, they are then released as a result because of a technical violation, and they get out, they cannot find a place to work, they cannot find a place to live. So what happens? Now the police have to go after them because people call the police, right? And so we cannot only talk about criminal justice reform, we have to talk about education reform. I have stats here, folks, for the Oxnard Union High School District, the Oxnard Elementary School District. For this generation today, this is the most important civil rights issue for them, is education. So once again, if we're going to talk about police reform, we're going to fall short unless we talk about overall reform. And anyway, so I'm being told my time's up. So thank you, Randy. Alex.
Thank you. And the final opening comments will be by Chief Scott Whitney.
Yes, good evening, everybody, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody that's watching on Zoom or on the local channel. It's very important to have these difficult conversations, and I respect all the panelists and everything they said. I come here tonight with an open heart, an open mind. We're not going to shy away from any of this. We're not going to take a defensive position. We see this as an opportunity to make the profession of policing better, and that's how we're going to approach it. We're going to take the initiative. For me to stay on track, I've made some prepared comments so I can get it in my 3 minutes. For much of our country's history, police departments enforce the status quo of oppression and discrimination. We know that. Much progress has been made, but more still needs to be done. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in our country. I believe there's a wide spectrum of department policies and department practices that range from subtle bias to oppression and brutality. And the answer isn't as simple as just a few bad apples. The reality, a lot of people don't recognize and acknowledge, California has been leading the nation in police reform. Lots of changes in the laws over the last 2 or 3 years in particular. I'm not going to go into all of those. I did that on our talk on Sunday, and I was told it was a laundry list of stuff, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But some of those changes, there's now a statewide use of force database. Personnel records that were previously considered confidential are now open to the public. One of the laws redefined the circumstances under which lethal force is justified. Law enforcement are now required to have use of force policies with 20 different criteria that they were not required to have previously. I can also tell you about a lot of positive changes that we've made within the Oxnard Police Department in my 30 years. And again, it'd be a laundry list. Nobody here wants to hear that tonight. But I am looking forward to talking about the ideas that I have going forward. I always tell people, we hire people with big hearts and a spirit for public service, and I'll never back away from that. If anybody doubts it, I invite you to come and sit on our oral panels. We do hire people, though, from the human race, talking a little bit, I think, about what Randi was talking about. And nobody comes to our profession with an adequate understanding of race relations, the history of police brutality, implicit bias. Nobody comes to us with that knowledge. Going along with what Mr. Martinez said, my guess is most people, I've talked to a lot of people over the last 4 weeks about this, my guess is most people do not graduate from high school, college, even an advanced degree, with much understanding of that. We're going to do our part and do more of that training within the department, try to do more of it in the academy. But there's a load to be borne by our school system as well, other entities. The next thing I tell people is we give officers the best training available. And I strongly believe our police academy is the best around. But the de-escalation training, it's just a fact, escalation training as mandated by the state is not enough. And as I think Ms. Gonzalez mentioned, our in-service training is insufficient. Being told I have to speed it up, so I tell people that we send our officers out to do a very, very tough job. It's both dangerous, but it's also rewarding. And there's been recent critique that our officers are asked to do too much. And I absolutely agree with that. Unfortunately, the answer isn't just as simple as defunding the police or cutting the police budget. I'm sure we're going to talk more about that later. And the last point, I'm going to wrap it up. I tell people is that we hold our officers to a high standard. There's this misperception that they're not held accountable, and that's just not true. Our police department, we're not perfect, but we do work very hard. Our officers, our civilian employees make many sacrifices to protect our community. We're always willing to change and get better. And Damon, I promise you, we will work with you. We may not agree on every single thing, but my guess is we probably will have more common ground than maybe you suspect. We stand with the black community, and we'll do whatever we can, and we'll work with anybody that wants to make positive change in our city. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, now we're going to move on to the middle section of tonight's program. Very quickly, if it's okay with everyone, when I call on you, if it's okay, respectfully, I could call on you by your first name. So the last time Chief Whitney and I spoke publicly about these issues, one of the things I said was that what matters with regard to my service to the city of Oxnard, what matters is what we do next. And I'm responsible as your city manager to hold the police department accountable, specifically our chief. So in that spirit, in this next segment, what we're going to do is Chief Whitney is going to describe some department policy change proposals that he and the commanders have been working on. And what we're going to do is we're going to do it just one at a time. And he's going to describe one, and then I'm going to ask a few panelists just to give their initial feedback. And what I've asked the panelists is, because we have so many people here that we're not going to go around for everyone, but based on what you hear from the chief and what you hear from the initial panelists that responds, if you have a very, very different response, let me know, and so I can call on you. So with that, Chief, can you go into your first proposal?
Sure. Sure. Just a quick background. The city manager and I talked about moving forward. We don't want to just sit here, be defensive. We want to move beyond hearing complaints. We'll definitely be open for that. But we also want to talk about moving forward. And with that spirit, and I've just kind of put these together, working on it all day today and kind of hot off the press. So this is a work in progress. But one of the things we did very early on after this is because the carotid restraint was a big issue on the news. We all saw that. And we banned the carotid restraint with the exception of self-defense. And I know the state may be going in a different direction, banning it completely, and I think that that is a bad idea. I think it is going to be unsafe for the officers. It's going to create an unsafe environment also for our community, but I understand we will always follow the law. So the change with our carotid is we changed it to where the carotid control hold may only be used to defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to an officer or another person. And I was talking to Regina before the meeting, and she asked me about, does that mean that an officer can put a knee on somebody's neck? And the answer is absolutely not. That is not allowed within our policy. So that is the change that we made to the carotid restraint. Alex, do you want me to go through all of the ones under policy changes first? That's probably the way we're going to get through this.
Yes.
The second one was we have a policy called duty to intercede, and within that policy was also a duty to report. We just changed that duty to report to, there was one word that we spotted in there and taken a second look from should to shall. So the officers, there's no discretion there. It's very clear. The third one, re-examine our policy manual to look for more opportunities to put de-escalation techniques in there. So there are several other policies within the manual where we think we could put more emphasis on de-escalation techniques. The fourth one, and this is we could probably spend the entire 2 hours talking about this, but this is we are making a commitment to examine our policies and our practices, and I think this may be where we might be able to have some common ground with Damon, to determine if they produce or maintain any racial inequities. And I have a couple examples on that, and the easy and the obvious one for me is Nextdoor. Nextdoor.com, most of us have that. They used to have a function within the app where you could report something directly to the police. They actually got away from that because they noticed there was too much racial profiling on the app. Even with their algorithm that they had on their app, they were still, too many of these were getting through and essentially reporting things to the police where there was a perception that there's racial profiling. Within the police department, if somebody calls 911 to report something, there's not a lot of screening. If they report suspicious circumstances, there's not a lot of screening that goes there. We generally send somebody. When when I was talking to a few of our black officers last week, and they gave me an example of one. They went to a call of a suspicious person in an apartment complex. He was a black man. They went and they contacted him. He was pushing a dolly, and he was basically working for a moving company, helping somebody move. So there's we probably need to do, this is the evolution of policing. We have to figure out a way, just because somebody calls 911 doesn't mean that an officer is going to go to that call. So that's just in the interest of time.
Okay.
And Alex, if there's one other thing I could mention, it's related to this, eliminating, it's called disproportionate minority contacts. I worked with juvenile probation to reduce the number of juveniles in the juvenile facility. It was built for 400 people, 400 kids. And this effort, we identified 9 different contacts that a juvenile has within the justice system. Only one of those 9 was a contact with police, but there's decisions that are made with every one of those contacts. It was led by experts. We do not have that capacity ourselves, but I see something along those lines with calls that come into 911. So the last thing I'll say is I put on here, it's E, if you have the handout, calls for service that we should not be involved in. All you have to do is listen to our scanner, and you will hear a lot of calls that the police department should not be going to, but we do. And I think there's a good recognition of that. I could go on, but
right. No, I know, so I'm going to stop you.
Yep.
So very quickly, I'm going to ask Regina and Randi to respond to these proposals, and very quickly let me review them. Ban use of carotid restraint except in instances of self-defense. Duty to intercede includes duty to report. This is where, I believe if an officer is witnessing another officer doing something wrong, and also you're changing it to should report to shall report.
That's right.
Re-examining the department's policy manual to look for opportunities to place more emphasis on de-escalation techniques. Also examining our policies and practices to determine whether they produce or maintain racial inequities, and also looking at the kinds of calls for services that police officers shouldn't even have to respond to. So let me ask Regina to start. I know that's loaded, but please give us your best shot.
Actually, I had sent earlier, the chief didn't get a chance to see it. The House of Representatives just passed a bill which outlines some of the things that you talked about, the George Floyd Justice Policy, HR 7120, where they're talking about holding officers accountable. The NAACP's position on that is that just as the citizens and the community is held accountable by certain laws, officers should be held for the same accountability. So in the case of what we've seen in Minneapolis, the officers are now being held accountable. As we've seen with the Richard Brooks incident, officers are being held accountable. So I do applaud. And so far from what our understanding is, and I'm hoping that law enforcement correct me, Oxnard and Simi Valley, it's a 2, I believe the sheriff also has taken a position of the no chokehold except for in self-defense. I guess my question is, as we know with anything, there's always some flaws. And my concern is, who's going to be looking at these accountabilities? Because we know that anybody can yell, just as we know with Trayvon Martin, I'm in fear of my life. And as we call them, the Karens, and people who yell these things and there's nothing going on. So in the case of an officer, you know, the body cameras were great, but we found out sometimes they turn them off. The NAACP has mandated that that camera is on at all times so that the community can see it. and that all the tapes, not just a portion, is being shown to the community. So I guess that's part of it. You kind of addressed, but you didn't address for me, and I'm sorry, Scott. He's not going to want to take me out to coffee after this. As far as the police cameras, and that's part of the, like I said, the legislation right now that is right now waiting for going before the Senate that the NAACP is pushing. So I just sent it to you, though. So.
Okay. So I'm also going to ask Randi Latimer to chime in on these proposed changes, given that you know the department.
Okay, great. Yeah, starting with the carotid restraint, you know, it's a practice. It's a one of the tools that officers have. You have pepper spray. You have taser, and what's going to happen is kind of go into a training mode where you really have to recondition the officers on determining what level of force, as you know, that they're able to use and which is appropriate, and it's going to have to be extensive training. But also in that training, you know, this is where you have the implicit bias that comes in, where you have the officer who has not encountered a certain or not used to encountering certain individuals, and they have a preconceived idea of what this person is. It's going to have to go along with that type of training, your use of force training, your TD must training, which is tactical decision making under stress. So I agree with these policies. But it's going to, as you know, will entail a tremendous amount of retraining for officers to not go there. In my 30 years of law enforcement, I was never able to apply a carotid restraint. I don't know why, but it was it's a good thing. As far as the identifying calls for service, it kind of really struck me. You're inevitably going to have to go to those calls. It's just going to happen. But once again, it's what happens when the officers get there and make that contact. Just because you get the call of a suspicious person doesn't mean you have to take it to the next level. The officers need to know what is suspicious, and and then have to learn how to de-escalate that situation, ask the appropriate questions, and not get into, once again, your implicit your biases on why is this person in this neighborhood? You don't belong here, which is often the complaint. I'm sure, Regina, you get several of those complaints. You're in the wrong neighborhood. What are you doing here? There was a term, if you were a certain race in a certain part of town, that was PC to stop, and that happened. That was a practice in Oxnard. And it was a unwritten rule, but it happened. And once again, officers watched it happen, and it was an unwritten rule. So it will have to, like I said, once again, a lot of training, a lot of reconditioning of officers to utilizing the appropriate tools on their tool belt, and not going to that escalated use of force that they're accustomed to.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm sorry. One of the things that when we talk about policies and that we are going to be advocating for, and it's going to be nationwide, and Damien probably can contest to that, is that we're seeking nonviolent crimes should not have violence. Nonviolent crimes should not constitute an arrest. And like I said, I brought up Mr. Brooks' case. He was drunk, and no doubt, and he ended up dead. And so those are a lot of times where we're seeing that funds should be expended in other areas, like with part of the first responders, probably having, like as you said, educating officers on de-escalating, and probably in some situations not having the officers go out there, because we all, once we see them, we go into a mode. And I think that's humanistic of anybody that's going into a mode when you see an officer. And what we found in some cases, when an officer is not there, even though he may be on the outskirts, the situation changes. And so when they talk about defunding, not necessarily defunding the police department, but reallocating funds where you can probably have other first responders assist with the police officers in some of these calls.
Thank you. Just minding the time, because obviously we could be here for days. So we have a few more policy proposals that I really want to get into tonight, especially. So I'm going to move on, Chief. Let's briefly outline the second set.
Okay, got it. I talked a little bit about this in my opening statement. We need more and better instruction. I'm just going to talk about a few topics. History of race relations, history of police brutality, police legitimacy, procedural justice. Nobody comes to us at the police department with a good base of understanding that. I'm going to kind of put out a challenge, and I will talk to the colleges, the local colleges, whether it's a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree. We need more instruction on that. We are also going to take the initiative, and again, as Cynthia said, our training budget is super low. It's a couple $100 per person a year. But we are going to, by the end of the year, add additional training in implicit bias, cultural proficiency, and then those other things that I had just mentioned, the history of race relations, history of police brutality, police legitimacy, etc. And then we also, I mentioned in the opening as well, we need more training on de-escalation. And then this is a new one. I don't think it's really been talked about. Maybe Regina was inferring to it, that disengagement training. It's not training that currently exists. I heard it in speaking internally to our officers. That incident in Atlanta is probably a good example where the officer could have disengaged, got on his radio instead of chase that person. So that type of training we're going to look into that.
And de-escalation and with the current state requirements?
Yes, the state requirement is a minimum. We're going to build on that.
Okay. So I'm going to start with Cynthia, responses to those proposals. Is your mic on? Thank you.
No, sorry. I think it's a great idea to include history of race relations, police brutality, and police legitimacy. I think it's necessary for us to do better when it comes to education, not just for the police, but overall, because I don't think we do enough. And I also agree with the disengagement training and making sure that, I guess, situations don't turn into the Mr. Brooks situation where he was drunk and then he was dead. And I think that it's super important that our officers receive the type of training that they need because, like Chief Whitney says, they don't come with that knowledge or that information, no matter where they come from. They don't come with that. And so I think that this is definitely a great start. We just have to put some timelines on this and also, as you said, go out into the community and talk to the different colleges that are training folks and that are educating them and sending them to the police force and make sure that this is happening. We know that there has never been enough education around the history of race relations and procedural justice. That's huge because if people have an understanding of what they're actually supposed to be doing, maybe there won't be so much confusion and maybe we won't have as many issues as we do. So thank you.
Okay. Peter, can you share your thoughts about these proposals on improving instruction?
Yes, I have quite a bit to say about this topic. First of all, this whole notion about race relations, police brutality, and police legitimacy, etc. As I said, I was a probation officer for many years, and every year we were required to go through post-training. and oftentimes they provided training on diversity. And I was always the first to sign up because I had an interest in it. And every class I attended had one thing in common. They were piss poor. They were just bad training, okay? So I think it's a matter of providing the training, but it's also important to provide good training. And what I would recommend is that you start by reading this book called White Fragility. This sets a foundation, folks, okay? And then the other thing I want to say about this is that the persons who teach these classes have to be qualified. For example, is there anybody here who denies that racial profiling exists? If you believe that racial profiling does not exist, please raise your hand. Because there is one instructor at Ventura College, criminal justice instructor, who teaches a community relations class and tells the students that racial profiling does not exist. Then they come to me and tell me, Mr. Martinez, so-and-so said that racial profiling does not exist. So of course, then I have to address that, and here are the articles. Also, regarding implicit bias and cultural proficiency, I think that should be part of the curriculum in all CJ classes because it's just such an important topic, so it has to be included. Then I want to talk about de-escalation training. I think that's very important, but however, I think it's more important to prevent the situation from escalating in the first place. Because once it starts to escalate, it's tough to de-escalate. So with the proper cultural proficiency training, you can prevent it from escalating in the first place. And this is why I tell my students, the minute you put on that uniform and the person sees you approaching, how they perceive you is going to make all the difference whether the matter tenses up or not. Because if it starts to escalate, it's downhill from that, folks. Okay, so you want to prevent it in the first place. So I think these are very important topics. But again, I think it's very important that whoever's going to talk about implicit bias or just explicit racism has to be qualified. And particularly with cultural proficiency, they do need to be qualified because I think it's so oftentimes, let's look at the others. Well, let's look at our internal operations. Let's look at our policies. Let's look at our procedures. And let's look at our practices. And give an example. I've been teaching at Ventura College as an adjunct instructor for about 22 years. And there was cases where this was just outright racism. And I documented every part of it. It was ignored. And finally, LULAC and the Latino Town Hall from Santa Paula took it over. And suddenly things started to change. Okay? But again, 1950s, the landmark case, Brown versus Board of Education, right? Supreme Court said separate but equals not. Okay? Well, Santa Paula was Ventura College was practicing just the opposite, separate and unequal, until LULAC and Latino Town Hall stepped up. Okay? So this is something I'm very passionate about. So at any time, Chief, if I can provide any input, you feel free to call on me.
Thank you. All right, let's, okay, Maite, please.
I wanted to make a comment about just like more and better instructions. I feel like something to me to make clear is that these can't be like one-off sessions that officers take. They need to be like sustainable, and even in like the instruction of what the consequences will be for their abuse of force and like repercussions that should be happening. Because I feel like if they think that they can get away with it, that's going to enable them to keep on doing it. So I think that definitely needs to be a conversation, so they know that they will be held accountable. And just as like one of the other panelists was saying, is that like these are hard issues that you're talking about. This isn't a history lesson. It's you're trying to you're trying to convince and
Maite, right into the mic.
You're supposed. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you.
What you're going to try to do with these more and better instructions is take away the internalized racism that police officers have. You're taking away a lot of implicit bias that is deeply rooted in people, and I think to a certain extent in everyone. So I think it's not an easy task, and I think that that's something that needs to be thought about. It's not just a one-time thing, and I would strongly urge you to have something that is sustainable for your police officers.
Thank you.
Alex, may I say one more thing?
Briefly, please.
Briefly. And the other is that we hear a lot about police forces, probation departments representing the communities that they serve, which I support 100%. But that is not, folks, a free ride, because I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles in LAPD. The largest group in LAPD are Latinos. And I can tell you, I do not want to be stopped by LAPD. Okay? And if you doubt what I'm saying, does the name Villanueva ring a bell? Sheriff in Los Angeles County? Okay. So we have to hold everyone accountable. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Terrell?
Yes, to talk a little bit about Peter's comments, and I do agree with him, and the term community-oriented policing, getting police from the actual community, saying that you wouldn't want to be stopped by LAPD, and I agree with you, I've actually been stopped by LAPD more than one time. But also, as you move up in rank, does that represent the community? So how many minorities are senior officers or sergeants? How many of them are commanders? How many of them are chiefs, assistant chiefs? That makes a difference also. So as you move up in rank, I think we would get a better response, or it would be better for the public if they were also minorities, people of color, or people that represent that community.
Thank you. Okay, I want to move on to the next. We actually have many more policy recommendations, but there are two more that I really want to make sure that we get discussed here with our panelists tonight. Then there are a few that we can summarize at the end. So, Chief, let's move on to the third set. If you can describe those very quickly.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. I'll read it for those that are viewing. Support efforts and partnerships to have mental health providers and substance abuse programs, work more closely with our officers in the field, and more efforts to support the homeless population and at-risk youth. You know, it's easy to say the police are involved in too much stuff, and we are. That's easy to say. But as a society, there's no safety net for those that are homeless, those that are drug dependent, those that are suffering from mental illness, and then the frequent offenders. There's no safety net for them, and people call us. Alex, you talked yesterday, just in the downtown since 2019, I think you said we got 20,000 calls for service. 2,000, I'm sorry. Lack of sleep. 2,000 calls for service just in the downtown for homelessness. It's easy to say we got to stop arresting low-level offenders. That's as low as it gets. That's as low as it gets. But there's like no service, no service, no service, and then arrest. That's the only option that we have. And so as a society, as a not only the city, because most of those services are provided by the county, who's going to step up and provide fill that gap where there's no service, no service, no service? Because people call us and they want, and it's not just downtown, it's the entire city. They want us to enforce the vagrancy laws that are on the books. And I will say we need to be better than that. We are not better than that as a society right now.
Okay. Maite, I'll turn it to you. Mike, and right into it.
Yes. I think that I'm glad that the department wants to support these efforts, partnerships, and more funding. And I think that I would just challenge you to put your money where your mouth is and shift your resources, your 45% of the budget, of the city budget that you get, to these organizations that need the money to mental health providers, substance abuse programs, homelessness. Like those programs and commissions exist within the city of Oxnard, or the Parks and Rec funding that they get. Like if you really want to support these efforts, then I think that you should give up some of your percentage to actually benefit. It's not just we support you in our presence or we support you by showing up and applauding you. It's by saying, I support you and I believe in the work that you're doing, so I'm going to give you some of my money so you can do the work that you need to do to help support us, so you don't have to go into the community. But you can't expect these other organizations to step up and take some of the responsibility off your shoulders if you don't provide them with the resources to do so.
Oh, thank you. Terrell?
So, being part of the city, working with the budget that we've been given, we try to utilize it as best as possible. That 7% of the general fund budget that we do use, I think we make good use of it. If we had more, I think that we can do more. Does that necessarily mean that that has to come from the police department? That's not necessarily my decision, but I can tell you that the more we have, we utilize it as best as we can, and I think we do a really good job with it. If you've been watching what's been going on in our city, I will say that the pie is too small for everybody. Does that mean that recreation and youth programs need less? No. That means that we do need more. So I will leave it like this. The more we have, the more that we can do, and we do need more.
Actually, I'm going to go to Cynthia and then Peter.
So I definitely agree with partnering and partnerships that create an alternative to calling the police. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, and they've had it for 31 years, and they have a de-escalation model for situations like this. And I agree with Maita. I agree with you in that I believe that if the police are really dedicated to this and dedicated to shifting from handling those low-level calls or handling like the mental health calls, then yes, I do believe that a certain percentage of their budget should be shifted that way. The budget was finalized yesterday, I believe, and my question is, how much of that budget did you consider shifting to this type of a program, or are we going to have to wait until next year for that?
Peter?
Yeah, I want to talk briefly about at-risk youth, because as a probation officer, I spent a lot of my career working with juveniles and spent a lot of time working with agencies that work with youth, including schools. But I want to share some numbers with you. The Oxnard Union High School District in the year 2018-2019, in math, only 21% of students met the state requirements in math. Keep in mind, 21%. In English, language arts, and literacy results, 40% of students in the Oxnard Union High School District met the state requirements. Folks, all those students are at risk. And again, if we're going to talk about making major changes as opposed to police reform, we need to start holding schools accountable as well. And so I say to any educators out there who are watching tonight, start holding your institutions accountable as well. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the budget issue, but I want to get into one more policy proposal with the panelists we have here. So, Chief, can you discuss number 4 really quickly?
Sure. I'll read number 4. It's pretty easy. And though I truly believe that our department thoroughly and objectively investigates critical incidents, I do support the idea of independent investigations by the California Attorney General or any other outside law enforcement agency for either officer-involved shootings or incidents resulting in death. That's very straightforward.
Okay. So very quickly, I'm going to ask Damon to address this first. I just want to let people know that issue is one of the most popular questions we're getting from our Zoom audience tonight. So it's a good thing it's on our agenda. Damon?
I absolutely agree that there needs to be independent investigations. That's part of the Black Lawyers of Ventura County. Our request is a diverse, nonpartisan group that would have that type of oversight and ability to investigate and then refer on to someone like the Attorney General. I don't think that the steps set in place are sufficient. I also am not convinced that having the Attorney General having another law enforcement agency oversee a local law enforcement agency, I don't always think is the best way to get to justice. I think someone from the outside oftentimes will have the best interests of the community in mind and be able to effectuate more change that way. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on that issue? Okay, let's. Yes.
Oh, this mask. But back to at-risk youth, I think the other thing is there's a lot of talk, L.A. specifically, about doing away with their school resource officers. And I think what has to be looked at is why they're being called into the classrooms in the first place. And this is where data is very helpful, because is it specific teachers calling in for the school resource officers in the first place when they shouldn't be called into the classroom? Secondly, I think it has to be real clear what the role of the school resource officers is in the first place. And is it, once again, a instructor or a teacher who cannot control his or her classroom, as a result depends on the school resource officer to do discipline, etc. So that information has to be very clear so that it determines the role of school resource officers, so that, once again, school resource officers are not being called in to deal with matters they should be dealt with by the classroom teacher or the school administrator. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, Regina, and then Randi, please.
So as you know, that we call that the education pipeline to prison. And so the NAACP has been for years fighting for resource officers to be removed off the campuses, because we start seeing that 80% of the calls were on minority students, specifically Black students. And as we know is that once the resource officers come in, and I'm Chief Whitney, I'm talking about LAPD. I haven't seen it in Ventura, well, Oxnard School District, because I talked to different districts, but where the police officers are coming in and they're making an arrest. And that, like you said, it starts systematically putting these young students into the system. And then at that point, it makes it difficult for them to get jobs, housing, and everything else. And it starts a pattern. So we've been fighting over 10 years for the removal of resource officers on the campuses.
Thank you. Randi?
Hey, Alex, I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
didn't know
Randi's
Randi.
next.
Randy, I hope you're going to talk about what I was going to talk about.
Chief, well, I was going to talk about the independent investigation first. I think it is a good idea for an independent investigation due to the fact that there's inherent distrust, and the police department needs to lend to transparency, and it makes Oxnard Police Department and other police departments better at having an outside independent source review the incident. On the school, I was a school resource officer in the city of Oxnard, and I actually was the sergeant and commander. The Oxnard experience, just I think, Regina, you alluded to it, is far different from the LA experience. So I think it does Oxnard a disservice to clump every school resource officers in general with everyone else, because our experience, we have made, and being Oxnard residents, Oxnard Police Department has made very strong inroads with connecting with our high school students and our middle school students and provide a resource. Oxnard, I keep saying I'm retired. I should be sipping on a umbrella drink. But Oxnard PD has done a very good job connecting with our students, and not only the students, but the families of those students. And I know the chief's goal was for every kid in our community to know a police officer. And I think the schools are a very good resource, along with other programs such as PAL, and for that to happen. So it gives our kids an inlet and a personal connection with those officers.
Okay, I'm going to go to the chief, then Maite, then Regina, then Cynthia.
So
Seems to be a hot
I wasn't
topic. Let's
planning on
go.
talking about it, but since it came up, 2008.
Briefly, Chief.
2008, I read an article written by the ACLU about criminalizing school misconduct. Talked to our school resource officers. We worked with every single school district in the city that we have a contract with. We told them we are not going to criminalize school misconduct. We're not going to be making those types of arrests. We entered into that MOU, and it has served as a model for other school districts in the state. If our school, we do not force the officers onto the schools. If the school districts, who loves the SROs more than the students is the principal and the staff. Basically, they all love the SROs, but for some reason, if the school district did not want that, if they didn't think it was valuable, they wouldn't pay to have it, and we would just pull them back. So thank you.
Okay. I think Maite, then Regina, then Cynthia. I hope that's the correct order, but let's go.
I would say, as someone who was recently in high school about 4 years ago, that I think the presence of police enforcement in schools sends a clear message to the students that we are potential criminals and that we need to be looked after in that way. Although I feel like school resource officers do provide a good relationship with the students there, I do think that it sends a message of saying you need to be watched and you need to be policed in schools, which I think is very negative. And then I think also allows for the criminalization of kids at a very young age. I don't know what LAPD and their situation in their schools looks like, but I know even 4 years ago when I was in high school, there were a lot of my peers that were being arrested on campus for small things. So I think that negating the fact that has a negative impact is ridiculous, because these are our safe spaces for students where we're supposed to feel encouraged and protected by administration, by the teachers that are there. And if they're doing their job correctly, then we shouldn't need police force on these campuses.
Thank you. Regina?
Randi, I have to debate you. And
that's why we're here.
That's right. In 2010, we had an incident where an officer at Oxnard High School pulled a gun on a group of students, and it turned into a mini riot that we had to go down there and basically stop it. And this was not under your time, so I have to say that. I don't recall who the police chief was, and I know it wasn't Jerry Williams. But at the time, I don't think that leadership at that time realized what the culture was on the campuses. And so we had an officer at Oxnard High School, and there was another incident where the officers did things where the kids were reacting, and I had to watch these kids say this is ongoing, we feel like criminals. And we had students that were honor students at Oxnard High School that were being criminalized. So for us to ignore it didn't happen in Oxnard, it absolutely did happen in Oxnard. So what I can say is I can commend leadership now after that incident taking steps to try to correct it. It still goes back to institutional racism and the culture of what the officers have. You talked about retraining. There's a whole lot of retraining that needs to be done. And sadly, you know, I know of an incident. Kid learned from one of the officers at Oxnard High School. Years later, he pulled him over, and the kid said he acted like he didn't know me. And his friends came around, other officers, and incited it. So there is a systemic issue, and we're not going to pretend Oxnard doesn't have it. And again, I do appreciate you, you know, listening to me when I complain about these different things and saying to his officers, zero tolerance. This is years, decades of this going on. I'm wondering, how do we stop that? How do we really remove it? And that was the only thing I'd say.
Thank you, Cynthia. And then Peter.
So I'm a little torn when it comes to the SRO issue, because as a parent, of course, I think SRO and I think very quick response if something happens on the campus and my child is on this campus. But then I think about it as a minority, and I think about it from that perspective. And for the most part, in minority neighborhoods, when the police come into your neighborhood, it's not a fun reason. It's because they're coming because there's a problem. And so those same kids go to school and they see the SRO on campus, and that negative connotation is still there, and that thought is, well, I'm a criminal because when they came into my neighborhood, I was a criminal. I will definitely commend OPD on their dedication to having better relationships with the community, and I feel like that's always going to be something that they have to strive towards because of what happens, and because people are arrested, they have this, you know, they're upset and they're afraid of the police. However, when it comes to school, I agree with some of the other panelists in that when these officers are on campus, the children often think, I'm a criminal, that's why they're here. But I will also say that I believe that the SROs, with more training regarding children, some child development or psychology, something, before they're placed at the school, I think that it will help them be better role models. And two, I agree, police should handle police issues. They shouldn't enforce school rules.
Thank you. So next is Peter and then Randi.
Yeah, so I wanted to reiterate what the chief said, because I agree with it 100%. And I am aware of the MOU that they have with the Oxnard School District. And I think that by and large, the officers do a very good job out there, but there's always a concern that's been voiced about how these students perceive officers on campus. The other thing I want to say about Oxnard PD, they do an excellent job of going on to campuses and talking to students and talking to parents. And that's very important because it's very culturally relevant. If you want to talk to the parents, they're going to be at the school, after school, to see their kids. So if you want feedback from the parents, that's the best time to reach them, because they're not going to come to the station. But if you go to them, that's very culturally relevant, very effective. Secondly, and I was going to say this earlier and I forgot to say this, but again, I teach criminal justice, and I always tell my students, if you're seriously thinking about a career in law enforcement, go on a ride along, go with Oxnard PD. And I have to tell you, without exception, they all come back and they think it was the best thing that ever happened to them. It's a very good experience for them to go on the ride along, but specifically, I highly recommend Oxnard PD because I know that they will be treated well and they will have a very positive experience. And when they come back to class the following day, that's exactly what they say. So, Chief, thank you.
Randi?
I was just going to point out, if you look at the pillars of 21st century policing that was instituted by the Obama administration, community policing is one of the six pillars of 21st century policing. Now, if you look at a school campus, you have thousands of our citizens who are impressionable, and community policing you have an officer who was selected because of their special skills to deal with those students. Just like, yeah, my mic's on. Just like officers are expected to go into our communities and form relationships with those neighborhoods and get to know the neighborhoods, what better place for those officers to interact and show that they are part of this community and care about our community. I was assigned to our PAL program back in the early 2000s, where I'm still getting contacted by kids on a daily basis. During this, after George Floyd was killed, I got several calls from kids that who are adults now, who trust me because of those relationships that I was able to form. And I would challenge you to talk to any school resource officer in this city. And once again, I think it's unfair to clump this city in with other cities, but talk to any of those officers who have worked on a school campus and who have formed relationships with those students.
Thank you. So we're gonna move on. Chief, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna summarize the other three items really quickly, and then we're gonna move on. There are three other things we want to support. They're very straightforward. One is to support a state/national effort to decertify officers that were terminated or resigned in lieu of termination. Next is to support creating a use of force database nationwide, and also to support the state's post-certified and statewide crowd control measures. So we're not going to have time to get into those tonight. I want to move on with the little time we have left, because we've had such good conversation so far with a few questions that are sent in. There are several questions about funding, so I'm going to address that very briefly. In terms of how we handle the city budget or any large organization, we're not going to make any drastic decisions on a dime. It's just not going to happen. It's unrealistic, and it would not be well thought out or smart. With regard to taking police funds to fund a variety of other programs, it doesn't work that way, because first of all, it's not a zero-sum game with regard to the city's budget. A lot of social and public health services are funded through the state via the county. So there are different buckets of public dollars. And education dollars also don't come from cities. So they're very different buckets. So our responsibility and our interest and our commitment to improving our department is not mutually exclusive from the other various efforts that are needed across our community. So going forward, based on the changes that we want to make, it may or may not impact the city police department's budget. And it's something that we will discuss along the way. But again, it's not something we would have done in the last few months, because we've been developing the annual budget over the last 5 months. So it just doesn't work that way. And again, it cannot be a zero-sum game. That just doesn't work. All right, so now I'm going to go to one of the questions we received. Chief, how many complaints of excessive force does Oxnard PD have on an annual basis? How many of those were proven true compared to how many contacts the officers make in a year? Multi-part question about complaints of excessive force.
Yep, thank you. I like this. I'm a stats person. We could all say subjective things, but at some point the stats do matter. Our officers respond to over 100,000 calls for service every year, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 contacts, either pedestrian stops or traffic stops. We usually get a handful of excessive force complaints a year, probably from 3 to 5. 2009, last year we got 2. Both of those complaints with the body-worn cameras, because 95+% of every use of force is the body camera is turned on. And both of those complaints we're able to resolve fairly quickly with the body-worn camera.
Okay. Speaking of body cameras, there were several questions about do we have them? Are they on all the time? How expensive is it? Can you briefly address our policies and use of body-worn cameras?
Sure. We're the first department in the county. I'm going to ask one of my assistant chiefs to text me real quick how much it costs. We were one of the first. We were the first department in the county to have body-worn cameras. We got those in 2016. The cost is over $300,000 per year. Essentially, every officer that is out doing enforcement has one. We have a policy that you have to turn them on every time you have some type of enforcement contact.
This is a question that can be answered by anyone that wants to. What are the alternate solutions to the rising needs for policing around homelessness, mental illness, drug dependency, and chronic offenders, taking into consideration the current budget deficit in Oxnard? What are the realistic and immediate responses going to be? Yes, go ahead. Right into the mic, please.
I would say that an alternative to policing would just be to invest in preventive measures so we don't have a lot of homelessness, so we don't have a lot of people with mental health issues, and providing them with the programs that will help them there. So I think instead of increasing policing around those issues, we should be trying to solve them before they become issues that have to involve police enforcement.
Okay. Next question I'm going to go to is directed to Chief Whitney. If you believe that the de-escalation training mandated by the state is not enough, have you taken extra measures for Oxnard PD?
That's what I was talking about earlier, that we are going to, yes.
You want to describe it a little?
Sure. Well, actually, yeah, we do. We in 2018, we bought what's called a force option simulator. It's where officers go into a room. It's, I think, probably 270 degrees. They interact with the screen. We give them scenarios because we know that when officers are put in stressful situations, not any officer, any person, when you're put in stressful situations, your mind and your body doesn't always work together, and your thinking mind isn't always on. So similar to, like, if you think about it from the fight or flight perspective. So we put officers in those situations, and we run different scenarios so that they make better decisions. So that's part of the de-escalation as well.
Okay. Thanks, Chief. This next question, I'm actually, instead of asking Chief Whitney, I'm going to ask Randi Latimer to address this. Would you say police officers, and I'm editing one word here, today, meaning now, in the Oxnard Police Department feel and are safe to report another police officer, as well as feel confident their report would be followed up on?
I can speak from experience, and you know, you have to go to culture of police work and just the I guess camaraderie, or the, you know, there's what's called a thin blue line, but I think the command staff and the policy set by Oxnard Police Department, core values, the hiring system, and the fact that everything is recorded. Not only Oxnard Police Department started their digital recording policy way before the body-worn camera, and now there's body-worn cameras. So I believe that the culture that is set by the supervisors and the command staff has developed a culture that officers aren't going to not say anything if they see something wrong.
Okay. I'm going to, because we're at the end of the evening session, but there's one more. There were several questions with regard to mental health. I think it's trying to combine these services and training for officers. So let me just read this one. What are the mental health assistance or requirement screenings that officers receive? Being exposed to violence daily and having to act on fight or flight must affect our officers. Many studies show that even the sight of a gun can make an individual more violent. What kind of mental health services are mandatory for our officers, and how much does the department invest in that? Chief?
Sure. I'll answer the last one first. We don't invest enough. To get hired, you have to go through a psychological screening process. When I started, if you got into an officer-involved shooting, you were usually back to work the next day. Now, if you get into an officer-involved shooting or a critical incident, even if it's not a shooting, it's mandatory. It's no longer optional. It's mandatory that you go and talk to our department psychologist, and then you take a week off, a minimum of a week, and then we also put you through those simulations to make sure that you're good. We also expanded our peer support program recently, and we are, unfortunately, 2020 has been a bad year, but at the beginning of the year, we started a police foundation. It's a nonprofit to raise money, and part of the purpose for that is to support kind of the mental health, the personal well-being of the police officers.
Okay. There's one more related question I want to get to, but because it touches on a topic we talked about earlier tonight, which has to do with when we're hiring. So the question is, are there psychological tests used as part of the application process? There are tests that reveal personality traits such as implicit bias, tendency to overreact in the face of danger, and possible emotional instability. Is that part of the screening process when we're bringing on board new officers?
So the answer is yes. Randy was actually part of our. He was in our recruiting process. So Randy, if you want to add more to that, but the answer is yes. Every officer goes through the background process. It does screen out people that are going to overreact. I'm not sure about the implicit bias issue.
Yeah, and to echo that, I was in charge of training. I actually conduct background investigations for several law enforcement agencies and public agencies in the state of California. There are certain points in the hiring process that you cannot get to the medical portion because of HIPAA. However, every police officer is screened. I'll add to that. The screening process needs to start on the selection process and asking the appropriate questions also, in reading and having a qualified person that knows how to read people and ask the right questions, whether you have indicators of a person that's not going to be a good fit for the job. But so it's a multi-pronged, multi-level approach to hiring, and yes, when they get to that psychological screening, hopefully you've already weeded out most of people that shouldn't be there, but that psychological screening is in place to try to catch those people.
Great. So it's after 8, but I'm actually going to keep going. That's the prerogative of being city manager. And this is a question that actually touches on the issue that most of you chimed in on earlier with regard to the school resources officers. It's a little bit long, but bear with me, please. Is there local level, in terms of here in our city, police and the school districts, data to show outcomes from the SRO programs? Are there specific performance measures or measurable outcomes that are evaluated to inform/guide the program? Are there quantitative examples That could include juvenile arrest rates in communities with SROs versus those without SROs, or recidivism of youth involved in juvenile justice system in SRO schools versus schools without SROs. Are there qualitative examples that may include perception of police by youth or the community or school staff perception and value of the SRO programs on campus? So if this data does exist, which is a great question, whether we are measuring and collecting or not, and if it exists, are these reports available for the public to review? It's a great question.
Yeah, I'm assuming you're giving that to me. That's that's a tough one. It's a great question, but the answer is no. We don't have the capacity for that type of data. We feel strongly that having the SROs on campus makes it safer for the students. The officers act as mentors for the students. I was on Hueneme High School campus in the end of January when Officer Nathan Martin was killed, and I went to Hueneme High School, and I talked to hundreds and hundreds of students that were crying. They love that officer. It's that like basic for us. But ultimately, it's the school's decision because it's their contract and they pay for it. So if they were interested in that, then that would be their prerogative.
So Maite, I want to ask you very quickly. And you have your hand up, but let me also ask you, in terms of because your comments earlier. While providing the critique of having SROs on campus, there was also a little bit of positivity in your comments. Is there a way to merge this to improve the program, or do you think we just shouldn't have it?
Yeah, so I just think we shouldn't have it on campuses. And even just from hearing like Randi talk about the positive experience that he was able to make and that other police officers have been able to make, what I hear and take away from that is that students need mentors in schools. Like students need to have adults that they can look up to, that know that they are cared for and that will be there to protect them. That I don't necessarily think that needs to be a police officer. There's a lot of members of the community. There's a lot of organizations and programs that can have a stronger presence in the schools. And I think that we need to, I'm now calling on like the Oxnard Union School District to think about who should we be bringing into our schools? Who is going to have a positive impact in our students? Is it alumni that want to give back, that want to empower the students, that want to show them what else is out there? Or do we want to have police officers that see them as criminals or are, and I think the message that we're sending are two completely different ones. One is saying, I'm here to support you and encourage you and mentor you, and the other one is saying, I'm here in case you do anything bad and I'm here to punish you. Whether those are the intentions of the police officers that are there or not, that's what young people see. And I think that if let's have more mentors, let's have more positive adults in those schools, and they don't have to be police officers, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. I want to go, I know it's late. I'm going to have one more question here. This hopefully is the final question, but it also gets at the heart of one of the reasons why we're here, which is profiling. So this is the question, do we have statistics about numbers of traffic and other stops by race? If so, how do those numbers compare with Oxnard's demographics? If not, why don't we have those statistics? Oh, Chief, that's for you.
Alex, thank you. That was a question that was emailed in, so I asked our crime analysis to pull the stats. The font is super small. From 2000, these stats are from 2015 to 2019, so 5 years. The census estimate for Hispanic was 73.7%. Number of tickets, the percentage was for Hispanic 73.1, so essentially the same. White population 14.8, 8%. Percent of tickets, 13.4. Black, percent of estimate of the population, 2.5%. Of tickets was 3.6. And Asian estimate was 7.2%. Of tickets was 2.3. And then the others were less than 1%.
Regina, go ahead.
So, thank you, Chief, for that. Sadly, that shows that sadly shows the disparity of numbers of blacks being pulled over when we only in this county are 1.6%. We are less than that in the city of Oxnard. You're talking about almost 3%. So we already know that nationally, one out of 3 blacks will go to jail. That's national statistics. So that's a bit high, unfortunately. And I was really sad to hear that. You know, like I said, considering in Ventura County a whole, we're 1.6%. And Oxnard just showed 3%. So I'm a little disappointed.
I know I said I would stop, but I'm going to continue for a moment because there's a new question, but it's actually related to this, but it's also related to what are we asking of police to do? The question is, do traffic stops really serve the public good? Is it an efficient use of police resources? What are the metrics and measurables that support the continuation of this practice? Could warnings replace fines and still achieve the same effect on persuading the driving public to be good drivers?
So, yep, and Randi was traffic commander, so if you have anything to add, but I was in Germany, Europe last summer, and hardly saw any traffic enforcement at all. But they do, you get a ticket by driving too fast, you get a ticket for changing lanes unsafely, et cetera. It's all via cameras. I would actually prefer that here. I would actually prefer that because then the camera doesn't send you the ticket based on the color of your skin. That's not consistent with state law, though, now. I'd love to have that technology. Oxnard is an old city, and it was not built for 200,000+ people and the cars. We have in we rank in our state as one of the worst in the state for cities our size for traffic safety, whether it's pedestrian safety, whether it's driver safety. We actually, as a department, don't write a lot of tickets proportional to the number of collisions we actually have. The focus, talked to one of our primary goals within the department is to improve traffic safety. And one of the ways you do that is by writing tickets. We are not in the business of writing tickets at 2 or 3 in the morning when somebody does a California stop at a stop sign at an intersection that is not having problems. But we do focus traffic enforcement at intersections in locations where we have injury collisions, particularly fatal collisions. We do focus there and we do write tickets. And I think the studies show that nothing improves somebody's driving more than a ticket when they're driving unsafely.
Okay. All right. With that, I think I'm finally going to end. Thank you, everyone, for participating tonight. I'm very grateful for all the panelists who volunteered your time. There are many questions that we have that we, again, we're committed. We'll answer them in writing and post them on our website within a couple weeks. And I just want to say, finally, that the City Council asked the police chief and me to do this so that we could have a City Hall sponsored forum. As I said at the beginning, there are many of these conversations happening around our community. Some of them are hosted publicly like this, some are not. There have been many demonstrations by our community members. So there's a lot of conversation going on. Our responsibility at City Hall is to figure out how, in this moment in American history, what do we contribute to improve equality for our community? And it is focused on police right now, but it cannot be police only. So there's a lot that we need to work on. The changes that we're proposing in the police department, we will determine what budgetary impacts that will have, and we will, when the time comes for that, it will be public. I actually look forward, Damon, from seeing what your attorney group sends forth to not just this city, but the region, I hope. So with that, I want to again thank everyone for taking your time. Thanks everyone who tuned in or into the Zoom meeting or watching us on TV or on YouTube. I'm sorry for some of the technical glitches. We have a projection booth in a chamber here that I think was designed for the Dick Van Dyke TV show. The technology is quite outdated. So thank you for bearing with us. So with that, I'd like to say good night. Thank you very much.